Hello and welcome to Fraud Talk, the ACFE's monthly podcast. I'm Rihonna Scoggins, the Content Manager for the ACFE, and today I'm joined by Amii Barnard-Bahn, recognized by Forbes as top coach for legal and compliance executives and the #1 global thought leader in careers by Thinkers 360. Amii specializes in consulting for global companies on ethics and compliance and leveraging her expertise as a former Fortune 50 executive. Amii, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks so much for inviting me, Rihonna.
So I would love to go ahead and just kick off our conversation today with a bit more information about your experience, your expertise, and kind of how you got to where you are today.
Sure. I started as a lawyer working in a litigation firm on employment issues, and then found that I really didn't like getting stuck with the facts. So I wanted to be in a position to be able to help make them. So I went into house and went into HR and did that for quite a period of time. Really enjoyed that and worked my way into ethics and compliance, including having the fraud investigations team reporting to me. So gained a huge appreciation for your field and our colleagues here at ACFE. And then went to start up several programs for compliance and ethics, one at McKesson, U.S. Pharmaceutical. So that was a really big and fun project. And then built compliance ethics program at a couple other companies for Allianz Insurance, and then became chief administrative officer of another organization and then CHRO of another organization. So kind of all roles that involve culture and tying things together so that you have the infrastructure to create a healthy, ethical workplace culture, as well as the behaviors, the incentivizing and punishing when you need to, the wrong behaviors. And now I'm an executive coach and a partner at Kaplan & Walker that specializes in compliance and ethics law. So I love the mix of helping individual compliance officers and heads of risk be successful, because it's a tough job. I know we'll probably talk about some of that today. So I have a special spot in my heart for anyone who tries to do these roles, to do the right thing, and then also to help organizations on more of a systemic level through my law firm.
So talking about experience and, what comes along with these kinds of roles, an unfortunate reality for a lot of fraud examiners is that, fraud's an uncomfortable topic. Companies often, they don't want to think about fraud. They don't want to think it can happen to them. They may, shy away from really necessary conversations that revolve risk, and, that discomfort is only amplified when we're investigating potential frauds, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do we prepare ourselves for those difficult conversations, especially when it, involves sensitive issues like fraud or misconduct?
It's important. I think over the years, I've learned both as a deliverer and then as someone who sits in the C-suite and sees how other leaders react to bad news. And then now as a coach with neuroscience and getting feedback around how sometimes well-intentioned bad news deliverers are received. It's a tough mix. And that's why I did a deep dive on this research and have written a couple of articles. There's a journal piece coming out this summer. And it's around 6 steps to delivering bad news, because there is a way to prepare for it, to make it more likely that your listener will hear you, respond the way that you're hoping they will, and where you won't suffer the political backlash that can come with having a role like this. So to get to a little of the neuroscience, bad news impacts us as individuals 5 times more than good news. And so it's important to think about that. I'm sure you can think of an example in your own life where you've ruminated over something where it's like, why does that bother me when this great thing happened today, right? I should be thinking about that. Well, our brains, unfortunately, are wired for risk, actually. It's the saber-toothed tiger thing. Our lizard brain is wired to just think about that one bad thing. Oh my God, why did that happen? How can that happen? How can I keep it from happening again, as opposed to the fabulous thing that happened that morning? So same thing happens in corporate. If we have bad news to deliver, we need to think about very carefully if we have the luxury of time. If we don't, it's best to study this ahead of time and just exercise the muscle and get really good at it. Would it be helpful to walk through the steps?
Yeah,
for
absolutely.
people? Okay. So the first thing is to psychologically prepare your audience. And what I mean by that is you want to give people at least a beat to understand, like as a heads up, basically, that, hey, I'm about to tell you something that really isn't great, that you may not want to hear, and I need you to hear it. So you want to say something like, say you're walking into a one-on-one, or you've asked for 15 minutes on an executive's calendar because it's urgent. You just discovered something in an investigation, whatever it is. You want to say something like, hey, I wish I had better news. And then pause, and then give them a second to be like, they're literally preparing their mind to hear it. So that's super helpful so that people can be, you don't want to shock someone. When you shock someone, our brain actually freezes for like 1/27th of a second. Have you ever, when you hear of someone who's stopped dead in their tracks, or that's what it means. It's like you need to ease in. So that's the first step. The second step is when you have the luxury of time to rehearse confident delivery. You want to come across as credible, that you know what's happened, that you're sharing everything transparently that you know, and you're sharing what you don't know yet and what you're doing about it. So preparing and rehearsing confident delivery has been proven to increase how we come across to the recipients of bad news. Because the other tough part about the neuroscience on this is bad news deliverers have been found in experiments to be less trustworthy and unlikable, which is bad news to deliver to our audience here. But if they've ever felt that, I'm afraid it's true. And compliance officers and HR people and anyone who's in a role that can be really tough are all in the same boat with us, right? So rehearsing is the number 2 step. Number 3 is to be fully present and focused. You just mentioned something earlier that can come into play, is that we can avoid or want to not really fully lean into the bad news that we're delivering. That's not a good idea. We want to really show people that we care. The way that you can overcome that predisposition to people believing that you are unlikable or that you have bad intent is to remind them why you're there, remind them of your good intent, proactively convey that beneficial intent. Hey, you hired me to find this kind of stuff. Guess what? I found something. I mean, that literally, that kind of thing, just remind them, oh, okay, yeah, that's right. I did hire this person to find fraud. So literally, it sounds crazy, but just those basic things. And there are subtle ways to do it. You don't have to always hit people over the head with it. It's more of an art than a science, but that's important. Conveying benevolent, proactive intent. And you can do that also by saying, this is what we're doing about it. This is what I recommend. This is how we're here to help. We're here to help. That kind of thing. The 5th is to explain without justifying, especially if by some reason your team had some impact on the negative outcome. You really want to take it on the chin. I think we've seen many public displays of people trying to explain away things they did. It doesn't go over very well, right? It's best just to say, we screwed up, and this is how we're making it right. Demonstrate that you care, that empathy. A little bit of empathy can go a long way. I appreciate that in audit, there is a very delicate dance in terms of independence. And I've seen that because my head auditor was always my BFF in-house as a compliance officer. We were, privately, tied at the hip in terms of helping each other do our jobs and doing the right thing for the organization. So being balancing that with some warmth, I think, is really important. And then the 6th is, if it's something that needs to change, if it's really urgent, you need to convey that sense of urgency. John Cotter is famous for his change management theory. And the most important point of change management theory is you have to have a sense of urgency for change to happen. And so what we tend to see, and I've seen it many, many times, and even in myself, is a tendency when we have to deliver tough news, we have a human tendency to want to downplay the bad news. And that's a mistake. When there's something that has to change, like a control or a big expensive something because of the issue that's happened or a risk that you found, don't downplay the urgency, because that will dissipate the sense of urgency that's needed to push change forward. We don't change in organizations unless the pain of the status quo is greater than the pain or cost of changing. So we have to make it clear that if we don't do this, this could happen. So those would be the things I would share.
Thank you for that. So I'm curious, when, we talk about these different steps, do you notice sort of a theme of what maybe some people struggle with, like, as a step more than others? Is there something that, like, you'd like to really stress to our listeners, like, work on this step especially?
Great question. I would say the benevolent, proactive intent. I think that sometimes audit and compliance can be perceived as being a little overly analytical and not a part of the team. Again, recognizing the need for independence. I do appreciate that there is that, and auditors have a heavier burden than compliance with that. And boards have it with CEOs. There's all kinds of protocols and good governance that needs to be set up in terms of how people manage their relationships. And I think that the best auditors that I've worked with that have had the best relationships with boards, with CEOs, have done a really great job of maintaining their intellectual independence and the need to do their job, as well as making it clear that they're there, that they understand the business, they're there to help the business. They want to leave as light a footprint as possible while doing their job thoroughly, proactively, that kind of thing.
Definitely. And I feel like that especially sets us up for success, especially when we think about, that stat about how, bearers of bad news, are often disliked more. It helps with that. So I really appreciate that aspect of it. What, and you've mentioned the steps. What are some effective strategies you recommend, for maybe initiating, like, that tough conversation?
Sure. I would say for regular updates, it's great to have a sense of the reactivity of your audience, I would say. With some I've reported to CEOs that were level 5 leaders, where I would say they were very thoughtful. One in particular was one of my former bosses is now the CEO of McKesson, and he was fantastic. He could immediately jump into any topic in the middle with me, so I didn't have to do a lot of preamble or reminding him what I did or any of that stuff. He had a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago, so he's an unusual CEO and just had a capability beyond sales and other types of CEOs that come to lead. So I knew I could just jump right in and tell him, and there would be no blowback. He would just be very factual and in problem-solving mode with me. I can't say that about everyone. So some other CEOs that I've worked with, highly reactive. And they imagine the worst when you come in or you share something. It's right through these two ends of the spectrum, I would say. So when you're dealing more with a reactive boss, I would say really, really preparing and anticipating what could go wrong in the conversation. In other words, not the outcome you wanted or intended, either in the actions the company's going to take or the impact on how you're perceived as a leader. So getting information about, and I think watching and being aware and having some high EQ around the reactive leaders is important, because you want them to be educated and informed in the right way about risk and about fraud. And, they really set the tone. So I think that auditors are actually in a wonderful place to help coach the CEO if they can create that kind of relationship. Because we all know that, everything from expense report fraud, which is probably one of the most common forms of fraud, but it's very leaky for companies and a big deal, especially during the pandemic, right? And then there's the big, really, really nasty ones, or third-party issues, vendors, those kinds of things that can also be huge. So I would say preparation, knowing your audience, thinking through possible anticipated responses. If it's a really important communication that you have, I would literally probably do some scenario planning. I just did some with a coaching client last week, and we came up with 4 different scenarios And so when he was in the meeting with the CEO, he was able to pivot very easily, and he'd already gotten over his initial jitters around how am I going to deliver this. He'd gotten confidence and had some muscle memory in his body, literally, around being comfortable with the discomfort.
Mm.
And most of the time we avoid uncomfortable situations. And unfortunately, that includes practicing. But I can tell you, if anyone's ever had to practice for a speech or memorize some dialogue, you know you do better when, and you become more relaxed. And it's more like a discussion when you've practiced it. So I would say, again, if it's something super important, tough audience, I would get some bullet points together. I might even run it by a colleague, just, and then have them in your back pocket, memorize them until you feel really comfortable with how you're placing it. And it's what happened, why should I care? How did it happen? And what are we doing about it? Right? Those are usually the 4 things an executive wants to know. And you just want to be ready with all of that.
Definitely. I really appreciate that statement about getting comfortable with the discomfort, and that emphasis on practice. One thing that you mentioned, and I'd love to talk a bit more about, is you mentioned EQ and knowing your audience. How important is emotional intelligence, when, having these tough discussions or maybe conducting interviews related to fraud? What role does it play in, achieving a successful outcome?
I think it can play a heavy role. When most of the time when I'm brought into coach, it's because of relationships. It's not because of someone's technical skill. I can't teach someone how to do X or Y, right? And then I'm coaching C-suite level anyway. So they've already, made the minimum requirements. And I've written about this a lot in some of my Harvard Business Review articles around, at a certain point, your skills don't matter anymore. People tend to over-index on skills, but at a certain point, it's all about your relationships. You've already made it to the skill level. Now it's, okay, can you relate to people? Do they want to work with you? Can you get outcomes from it? And so the EQ becomes exceptionally important past, I'd say, a director, senior director level. That's really what it's all about. And some people get cynical about that, like, oh, it's just who you know, that kind of thing. Yes, and we're social animals. We need to trust each other. We need to be able to work together. So it is what it is. So I think that when you choose a role, like a risk or compliance or an audit role, it automatically puts you on the other side of people. And that can be very, very challenging. And in fact, some of the social science research has actually found that when we deliver bad news, some people ascribe an ill intent to us, that we actually wanted the bad thing to happen, because we're meaning makers as people. We want to understand why, like, why did this happen? Why did this person do this? And it doesn't completely make sense, but I'm happy to share the research with you. It was fascinating. So when we choose a life and a profession like compliance or risk or audit, that also actually gives people a pass at disliking us, because we chose a career that's unlikable. It's like we chose a career, we chose, our fate in a way. And I know, right? So this is why I write about it, because I think it's very, very important for our professions to understand this and have strategies to overcome that bias.
Do you have any maybe starting points for where people, who aren't quite comfortable with that skill set yet can begin?
With EQ, in terms of getting better at people, I'd always say know yourself first. And there are some wonderful, really reasonable assessments out there. DISC is one that's super common in terms of what's your personality type. And then understanding that everyone in the workplace is a different type, has different preferences, different motivations, different interests. I have a self-assessment on my site that may help people in that direction in terms of self-awareness, increasing your self-awareness around how you're perceived, doing a 360. If your HR department offers 360s for leaders, that's a wonderful thing to do with your team. If you're an audit leader, doing it with your team is a really good team experience, because frankly, they're difficult. You sometimes get feedback that's really hard to hear. and really critical to moving ahead and not having any blind spots. And if you do it as a team, you can support each other. You can say, oh, okay, I got this feedback that I come across kind of brusque. I'm going to work on that. Oh, I did too. Okay, let's work on that together. You can make it a team. I try to, that's something that makes something that's difficult news, right? And then it shows you care. It shows that you want to know how you're showing up to clients. And one quick step in this direction, if you don't have an HR support or 360, is to ask your key stakeholders, including your direct reports, including CEO, your board, whomever. You can ask them and do a self-check and just say, I'm really interested in partnering and being the best I can be at what I'm doing. What one thing could I do that would make me more effective in my work with you? And pause and listen. And you'll usually get, because you're being very specific about just one thing, and you're asking for it. So you're making it psychologically safe for the person to give you the feedback. You're creating that space that we talked about earlier in a different context. That's really important. And sometimes people say, oh, thanks for asking. Let me come back to you. And that's fine. And then just, bring it up again. But number one, that does two things. Number one, it shows you care. And so you already get huge brownie points just by asking. So simply by asking, you're bonding in the relationship. Number two, you're setting a great example for your organization. Everybody should be asking this, in my opinion. This is something I share all the time with people in terms of being aware of how you show up and not having derailers, not having blind spots, which can really kill your career the higher you go. And people may not tell you, or you may get it too late. That's sometimes what I see in my coaching too, and that's really a shame. I've been asked before, if I could give my younger self advice, what one thing would I say? And I would say getting better at giving and receiving difficult feedback would be the number one thing. And I tell my daughters who are now going to be entering the job market fairly soon, the same thing, because it's tough, but we have to just get over ourselves, because if we don't know something about how we're showing up, it's still out there. It's not like it's not there. It's like putting a paper bag over your head, right? It's not there. It is there. And so you'd rather know, because then you can do something about it. Frankly, I consider it risk assessing ourselves in terms of getting to know ourselves and, I have a bad temper, or I can be scared of delivering bad news. I can not react proactively to a performance issue. I delay too long, or I don't set proper boundaries. All these things we need to know about ourselves so that we can make better choices next time.
I love that. I also think it kind of, further feeds into, we're creating a culture of, asking for that feedback, asking for, feedback we might not like. And then our organization gets a bit, better and better about having difficult conversations. So I really love how that, can feed into each other.
Yeah, for me, this is all about walking the talk in every way. And so if we get good at speaking up and psychological safety for our own feedback, I personally believe that drives a better culture that can talk about risk in a really intelligent, thoughtful way, and so that it's a holistic, sustainable business, right? And it's not just about making money. It's not just about the numbers.
Yeah, definitely. One thing that you mentioned earlier, and I'd love to kind of bring the conversation back around to, you talked about, knowing your audience, knowing, who you're talking to. So March is Women's History Month. And I would really love to get, your insight on, the role of gender in difficult conversations, in your experience, working with all of these different companies and people. How have you seen gender play a role in the dynamics of difficult conversations?
It does play a role. And I'm going to start off just by saying it's not fair, what I'm about to say, and I get it. And there's some gender judo that women in senior roles need to do and be aware of. And sometimes society doesn't change as quickly as it should, right? We have some wonderful male allies out there. So I know they're listening and are supportive. And there's been more and more talk about this. So luckily, I think our current generation is growing up better equipped. The men are better equipped to help women watch where they might be being treated differently. But in general, leaders need to balance two things to be effective in the workplace. They need to balance approachability and assertiveness. And some combination of that makes really ultimately their brand, to really reduce it down to just two things. What we found with gender is that for men can lean into their assertiveness, and they don't have to be as approachable to be respected and liked even. With women, what we find is women need to lean more into approachability than assertiveness. If that balance is off and they lean too far into assertiveness, and we've seen this with several public figures, they can get hit with a likability penalty. So having that EQ and having that awareness can be important so that women don't get unfairly discriminated against or punished or not listened to in a conversation. And again, it's not fair, but it is the way that the genders have just evolved in most societies. And America is much better than many other organizations and cultures in which I've supported people. Gotten better. It's getting better. And there's always more work to do. And I would say, not every man or woman fits into a particular stereotype either. I've coached men who have had a hard time being heard and asserting themselves. So I don't want to, broad brush everybody, but that's how I would say. So just being aware, adding warmth in general at the right time, at the right moment is very helpful. And I think that can be a little off-putting for some women because we've all probably been told, oh, just smile more, which is right. The number one sin. There's nothing that can, make you shoot from 0 to 100 more if someone says that. And I got that feedback at one point too, because when I get really analytical, when I put my attorney hat on, I can get really stoic and I don't realize it. And so it's a habit I had to change actually in terms of smiling more. It gets more natural as you practice. But I would say that there is something around what's otherwise a really annoying insult to say to smile more. That it's that approachability. So
definitely. I really appreciate that advice and that perspective that you have. So before we kind of wrap up our conversation, Amii, is there anything that you want to highlight, any upcoming work that you're doing that you'd like to let our listeners know about?
Sure, thank you. Well, they can go on my website and pick up a PDF of the 6 steps. I've outlined them there. I also have written for Compliance Week on the topic, and I have a journal article that's much more extended that's coming out in Leader to Leader, which is the Frances Hesselbein, University of Pittsburgh Leadership Journal. It'll be coming out this summer, and that has some actual case examples of these individual steps. I interviewed people from Afghanistan Army veterans to Wall Street bankers. And so I think that will be, my hope is that illustration will help us remember the concepts so that to make it easier for people to remember in the moment. So I'm doing that. And then just continuing with some compliance and ethics work, speaking at several of our compliance and ethics conferences and continuing to writing. I'm writing a piece right now for Harvard about layoffs and how to communicate them well. Because for me, it's all about balancing what needs to be said with empathy. And there's a lot of that going on right now. So those are some of the things I'm working on right now.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Amii, so much for being here today. I really appreciated our conversation.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for inviting me. People are welcome to reach out and connect on LinkedIn. And I have a newsletter and hundreds of free resources. I keep a library on my website, so you can literally just go under resources and pick up pretty much anything I've ever written or spoken about.
Perfect. And thank you for listening. You can find this podcast along with all other episodes of Fraud Talk on ACFE.com, Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. This has been Rihonna Scoggins, signing off.